The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport's private terminal. Sarah Johnson's black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the exclusive entrance at precisely 7:30 a.m., right on schedule as always. The 42-year-old tech CEO had built her entire career on being punctual and professional, and today was no different. As the car came to a stop, Sarah checked her reflection in her phone screen one last time. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back in a sleek bun, and her navy blue business suit was perfectly pressed. She had learned long ago that in the corporate world, appearance mattered, especially for a black woman who had fought her way to the top. The driver, Marcus, who had been with her company for the past 3 years, quickly stepped out to open her door. He had always admired how Sarah carried herself with such quiet confidence. "Have a good flight, Miss Johnson," he said with a warm smile, retrieving her overnight bag from the trunk. Sarah thanked him with her usual politeness, grabbing her executive briefcase, a gift she had bought herself after selling her software company for $300 million last year. The private terminal was a familiar sight to Sarah. Its glass walls gleamed in the morning light, and the exclusive lounge area inside was visible from where she stood. She had flown private for the past 5 years, gradually working her way up from chartered flights to finally owning her own Gulfstream G650. The jet was her pride and joy, a symbol of everything she had achieved from humble beginnings in Detroit. Walking towards the entrance, Sarah mentally reviewed her schedule for the day. She had an important meeting in San Francisco at noon with potential investors for her new tech venture. The flight would take just over an hour, giving her plenty of time to prepare. Her assistant had already sent all the necessary documentation to the terminal staff, as was their usual procedure. Sarah noticed a few other passengers in the terminal: a famous actor she recognized from movies, a well-known business tycoon, and what appeared to be a professional sports team. This was normal for LAX's private terminal, where privacy and efficiency were guaranteed for those who could afford it. The terminal staff usually recognized her immediately, greeting her with professional courtesy and quick service. As she approached the glass doors, Sarah pulled out her identification and flight documentation, even though most of the staff knew her by name. Her mother had always taught her to be overprepared, a lesson that had served her well throughout her career. The leather bag on her shoulder contained extra copies of everything she might need: her pilot's manifesto, plane ownership papers, and even her company's documentation. The morning air was crisp, typical for a Los Angeles winter day. Sarah could see her Gulfstream G650 parked in the distance, its white exterior gleaming under the morning sun. The sight still gave her a thrill of pride, even after a year of ownership. The tail number, N789SJ, her initials incorporated into the registration, was visible even from this distance. Other airport staff were busy with their morning routines, fueling aircraft, checking safety protocols, and guiding planes to their designated spots. The familiar sounds of jet engines and ground equipment created the usual symphony of airport operations. Sarah loved these early morning moments at the airport, when everything seemed full of possibility. She checked her watch again: 7:35 a.m., perfect timing. The flight crew would be completing their pre-flight checks now. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen were her regular pilots, and they knew her preference for punctuality. The flight attendant, Jessica, would have already stocked the plane with Sarah's preferred breakfast: steel-cut oatmeal with fresh berries and green tea. As Sarah reached for the terminal door handle, she felt the same sense of accomplishment she always did when preparing to board her private jet. It had been a long journey from the small apartment she grew up in to owning her own aircraft, but every sacrifice and late night had been worth it. Little did she know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. The automated doors slid open with their usual soft hiss, releasing a burst of cool air-conditioned atmosphere. Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking confidently on the polished floor, unaware that she was about to face a situation that would not only test her patience, but would eventually lead to significant changes in the private aviation industry. As Sarah stepped into the private terminal, she noticed something unusual. Instead of the familiar faces that typically greeted her, a new security guard stood at the check-in desk. Thomas Mills had been working at the terminal for only 2 weeks, and he immediately straightened up when he saw Sarah approaching, his face showing a mix of suspicion and authority. "Excuse me, ma'am," Mills called out loudly, stepping from behind his desk. This is a private terminal. You'll need to head to the main airport entrance. His voice carried across the quiet space, causing several heads to turn. Sarah noticed how a few other passengers nearby, all white, had walked in moments before without any questioning. Sarah maintained her professional composure, something she had mastered over years of dealing with prejudice in the tech industry. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her identification and flight documentation. "Good morning," she said calmly. "I'm Sarah Johnson. My plane is scheduled for departure at 8:15. Mills barely glanced at the documents she held out. "Right," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "And I'm the President of the United States. Like I said, the main terminal is that way." He pointed toward the exit, taking a step closer to Sarah, trying to use his height to intimidate her. A couple nearby whispered and stared, but no one intervened. Sarah felt a familiar knot in her stomach, the same one she felt countless times before when faced with such treatment. But years of experience had taught her how to handle these situations with grace and firmness. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm, "I own the Gulfstream G650 parked outside. Tail number N789SJ. I've been flying from this terminal for 5 years. Would you please look at my documentation?" She held out the papers again, this time more insistently. Mills crossed his arms. "Listen, lady, I don't know how you got in here, but I've been working security for 20 years. I know what private jet owners look like, and they don't look like." He paused, leaving the end of his sentence hanging in the air, but his meaning was crystal clear. Sarah noticed Jessica, her regular flight attendant, walking through the terminal. Their eyes met, and Jessica's face registered shock at the scene unfolding before her. She quickly turned and hurried toward the staff area, presumably to get help. "Mr. Mills," Sarah said, reading his name tag, "I understand you're new here, but your assumptions are both incorrect and inappropriate. I've already provided my identification, plane registration, and flight plan. What additional documentation do you need?" Mills scoffed, reaching for his radio. "I need you to leave before I call airport police. We don't need any trouble here." His hand rested meaningfully on his security badge, a gesture that made Sarah's heartbeat quicken, though her exterior remained calm. Around them, the terminal had grown quieter. Other passengers and staff had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Sarah could see phones being pulled out, some people recording the interaction. She noticed a young black girl, probably around 12, watching wide-eyed while clutching her mother's hand. That sight strengthened Sarah's resolve. She had faced similar barriers throughout her career when seeking funding for her startup, during business meetings, and even after becoming successful. Each time, she had stood her ground, not just for herself, but for others who would come after her. "Mr. Mills," Sarah said, pulling out her phone, "I'm going to make 2 calls. One to your terminal manager, who knows me personally, and another to my lawyer. I'm also going to record this interaction, as is my right. Would you like to check my documentation again before I do that?" Mill's face reddened, but he stood his ground. "Are you threatening me?" "That's it. I'm calling security." He reached for his radio again, his hand slightly shaking now, either from anger or nervousness. Sarah had already started recording on her phone and was dialing the terminal manager's number with her other hand. She knew every second of this interaction needed to be documented. As a tech CEO, she understood better than most the power of recorded evidence. The situation had reached a boiling point. Other staff members were gathering at the edges of the scene, some recognizing Sarah but unsure how to intervene. The discriminatory confrontation that had begun as a quiet challenge was about to explode into something much bigger, something that would soon make headlines and change policies across the private aviation industry. The terminal manager, Robert Chen, burst through the staff door less than 2 minutes after receiving Sarah's call. He was still holding his phone, slightly out of breath from running. His face showed a mix of horror and embarrassment as he took in the scene before him. "Ms. Johnson," Robert called out, hurrying toward them, "I am so terribly sorry about this." He had known Sarah for 5 years, ever since she started flying private. He had even attended the celebration when she purchased her Gulfstream last year. Mills turned to look at his manager, confusion crossing his face. The confidence he had shown moments ago began to crack as he watched Robert bow slightly to Sarah, something he did only for the terminal's most valued clients. "Thomas," Robert said sharply, This is Ms. Sarah Johnson. She's one of our most respected clients. He turned to Sarah, his face apologetic. Ms. Johnson, I was just reviewing the quarterly maintenance report for your aircraft when you called. Everything is in perfect order for today's flight. Mill's face began to pale as the reality of his mistake slowly dawned on him. He watched as other staff members approached. The fuel service manager, the cleaning crew supervisor, even the catering team, all greeting Sarah by name with genuine respect. Her aircraft. Mills stuttered, his earlier arrogance dissolving into disbelief. Sarah stood straight, her 5'6" frame somehow seeming to tower over Mills despite his greater height. Yes, Mr. Mills. My aircraft. The Gulfstream G650 that you can see through those windows. I purchased it last year for $65 million after selling my software company. The young black girl who had been watching earlier tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something, her eyes shining with admiration as she looked at Sarah. Several phones were still recording the scene, capturing every moment of Mill's realization. Robert quickly pulled out his tablet and pulled up the terminal's client database. Mr. Mills, Ms. Johnson isn't just a jet owner. She's one of the youngest tech CEOs to ever purchase a G650 outright. Her company's software is probably running on the phone in your pocket right now. Sarah watched as Mills scrolled through her client profile on Robert's tablet. She could see her achievements flashing across the screen. Forbes 30 Under 30, Time Magazine's most influential people, recipient of the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. The same credentials Mills hadn't bothered to look at minutes ago. I didn't. Mills began, but Sarah raised her hand to stop him. Mr. Mills, she said, her voice level and clear enough for everyone to hear, I don't believe you failed to recognize me because of poor training. I think we both know why you assumed I didn't belong here. She paused, letting her words sink in. The interesting thing is, I've owned this jet for a year, but I've worked my way up through every level of aviation before that. I started with commercial flights, then fractional ownership, then charter flights. I earned my place here, just like every other passenger. The terminal had grown completely silent. Even the usual airport announcements seemed muted. Several of the other passengers who had walked in earlier without being questioned looked down at their shoes, uncomfortable with the obvious discrimination they had witnessed. Jessica, Sarah's flight attendant, stepped forward with a folder. Ms. Johnson, your flight plan is ready, and Captain Rodriguez has completed all pre-flight checks. We're ready when you are. Sarah nodded, then turned back to Mills, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. You know what the hardest part of this is, Mr. Mills? It's not your treatment of me. I've unfortunately grown used to that. It's thinking about all the other people you might have turned away who didn't have the power or position to stand up to you. Robert was already on his phone, likely calling HR. Several other staff members were shaking their heads, some taking notes, others still recording. What had started as a routine morning had turned into a moment that would change not just Mill's career, but the entire culture of private aviation security. As Sarah finally walked toward her gate, she heard the young black girl say to her mother, "Mom, I want to be just like her when I grow up." And in that moment, Sarah knew that standing her ground had been about much more than just herself. Sarah's phone continued recording as events unfolded rapidly in the terminal. Her finger hovered over the stop button, but years of business experience told her to keep documenting. What had started as a discriminatory encounter was quickly turning into something much bigger. Within minutes of Robert's call, Linda Maxwell, the airport's chief of operations, arrived at the terminal. Her high heels clicked purposefully across the polished floor as she approached, her face set in a serious expression. Behind her walked James Torres, the head of airport security, and Patricia Williams from the legal department. Mills stood frozen, watching the group of senior officials gathering around them. His earlier attempts at explanation had trailed off into nervous silence. The security radio on his belt crackled with routine messages, but he didn't move to answer them. Ms. Johnson, Linda said, extending her hand. I came as soon as I heard. Would you be willing to step into our private conference room to discuss what happened? She shot a stern look at Mills, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. Sarah checked her watch. It was 7:50 a.m. She still had time before her scheduled departure. Of course, she replied. Though I should mention that several passengers recorded this incident, and I have my own recording as well. The young black girl and her mother from earlier were still watching. Sarah noticed them whispering to each other, the mother now typing something on her phone. Social media would soon be buzzing with what had happened here. In the conference room, Sarah sat calmly as Linda pulled up the terminal's security footage. Multiple camera angles showed the entire incident in crystal clear detail. They watched as Mills stopped Sarah, ignored her documentation, and attempted to intimidate her while letting other passengers walk by freely. "This is unacceptable," James Torres said, shaking his head as he watched. "We have strict protocols about checking credentials, and they apply to everyone equally. What I'm seeing here is textbook discrimination." Patricia Williams was taking rapid notes on her tablet. "Ms. Johnson, I want you to know that we take this extremely seriously. Not only did Mr. Mills violate our security protocols, but his actions could constitute a civil rights violation." Linda leaned forward in her chair. "We've already begun internal review procedures. Mr. Mills will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation." She paused, looking directly at Sarah. "But we'd like to know what you want to see happen here." Sarah thought about the young girl outside, about all the other people who might face similar discrimination. "I want systemic change," she said firmly. "This isn't just about punishing one person. It's about preventing this from happening to anyone else." As they talked, Sarah's phone buzzed continuously. The incident was already spreading across social media. A video clip had gone viral, showing the moment when Mills learned he had tried to block a jet owner from her own plane. #Privat Terminal Prejudice was trending. Robert knocked and entered the conference room with more news. "Ms. Johnson, several news outlets are calling for comment." And he hesitated. "The FAA has been notified about the incident. They're interested in reviewing our security procedures." The gravity of the situation seemed to hit everyone at once. What had started as one guard's prejudiced actions was now escalating into a major incident that could affect private aviation policies nationwide. Patricia typed faster on her tablet. "We need to get ahead of this. Ms. Johnson, would you be willing to work with us on improving our training programs? Your perspective would be invaluable." Outside the conference room, they could hear the growing buzz of conversations. More airport officials had arrived, and the story was spreading through the terminal like wildfire. Mills sat alone on a bench, his security badge already turned in, looking shell-shocked. Sarah's phone showed a message from her assistant in San Francisco. "Meeting participants are seeing the video. They're all expressing support and can wait if you need to handle this situation first." Linda looked at Sarah apologetically. "We can arrange another flight for you if you'd like to postpone your departure." But Sarah shook her head, standing up. "No, I won't let this incident disrupt my schedule. But," she added, looking at each person in the room, "I expect to see real changes by the time I return. This isn't over. It's just beginning." As she walked out of the conference room, Sarah could feel the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just about one flight or one guard anymore. It had become a moment that would force the entire private aviation industry to confront its prejudices and policies. As Sarah walked toward her gate, the terminal had transformed into a hub of intense activity. Staff members who had known her for years were coming forward, each one eager to share their positive experiences with the airport officials who were now gathered in groups throughout the terminal. Jessica, her flight attendant, approached with tears in her eyes. "Ms. Johnson, I've worked with you for 3 years, and you've always treated everyone with such respect. I need to tell them about the time you helped pay for my mother's medical bills when our insurance wouldn't cover it." More stories began pouring out. The maintenance crew talked about how Sarah knew each of them by name and always asked about their families. The cleaning staff mentioned how she insisted they be provided better break room facilities. The baggage handlers recalled her fighting for their holiday bonuses to be increased. Meanwhile, other private jet owners who regularly used the terminal were calling in. Many had already seen the viral video, and they were furious. Bradley Cooper, a famous actor who frequently flew from the terminal, called to say he was prepared to make a public statement supporting Sarah. Several CEOs threatened to take their business elsewhere unless significant changes were made. Linda Maxwell, the chief of operations, was now dealing with a full-blown crisis. Her phone rang constantly with calls from the media, aviation authorities, and the airport board members. She had already scheduled an emergency board meeting for that afternoon. "Ms. Johnson," Linda said, hurrying to catch up with Sarah before she boarded her plane. The airport board chairman would like to speak with you personally. He suggested forming a diversity and inclusion committee for private aviation, and he wants you to lead it. Sarah paused, considering the offer. Through the terminal windows, she could see her Gulfstream waiting on the tarmac, its engines already running for departure. Captain Rodriguez stood at the bottom of the stairs, waiting to welcome her aboard as he had done hundreds of times before. The young black girl who had witnessed everything was still in the terminal with her mother. They were talking to a reporter who had managed to get inside. Sarah overheard the girl saying, "I never knew black women could own planes. Now I know we can do anything." Robert Chen approached with a thick folder. "Ms. Johnson, I pulled all our security protocols and training materials. The discriminatory gaps are obvious now that we're really looking. Would you be willing to review them when you return from San Francisco?" Security Chief Torres joined them, his face serious. "We've already contacted other private terminals across the country. This isn't an isolated incident. We've received reports of similar discrimination in other locations. Your experience could help change the entire industry." Mills sat in a corner, writing a statement with a human resources representative. His hands shook as he wrote, and his security uniform had been replaced with a plain shirt. The reality of his actions and their consequences seemed to be sinking in with each passing minute. Patricia Williams from Legal approached with an update. "The video has reached over 1 million views. Civil rights organizations are calling for industry-wide changes. The FAA is sending representatives this afternoon to begin a formal review." Sarah looked at her watch again. It was 8:10 a.m., 5 minutes before her scheduled departure. Despite everything that had happened, she was still on time. She turned to address the group that had gathered around her. "I'll help with the changes," she said firmly. "But I want real action, not just words. We need new training programs, clear anti-discrimination policies, and regular audits to ensure compliance. And I want to see opportunities created for minorities in private aviation, from pilots to terminal staff." Linda nodded eagerly. "We'll draft a comprehensive plan. The board is prepared to allocate whatever resources necessary." As Sarah finally walked toward her plane, she heard someone clapping. Then another person joined in, and another. Soon, the entire terminal was applauding. Staff, passengers, and officials alike. The young black girl jumped up and down, cheering with them. Sarah climbed the stairs to her jet with dignity, turning once to wave to the crowd that had gathered. What had started as an attempt to humiliate her had instead become a catalyst for change. As she settled into her seat, she knew that her return flight would be to a very different terminal, one that was already beginning its transformation. By the time Sarah's plane landed in San Francisco 2 hours later, the incident had exploded across national media. Her phone lit up with hundreds of notifications as she stepped off her jet. Videos of the confrontation had been shared millions of times, and hashtag Private Aviation Equality was the top trending topic on social media. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News were all running the story. Their headlines varied, but all focused on the same shocking incident. Tech CEO racially profiled at private terminal, and discrimination in private aviation exposed. Sarah's assistant had already received calls from Good Morning America, The Today Show, and several major newspapers requesting interviews. Back at LAX, the consequences were swift and far-reaching. Thomas Mills had been officially terminated from his position. The Human Resources Department discovered that he had a history of similar incidents at his previous job, which he had hidden during his application process. This revelation led to an immediate review of their hiring procedures. The airport board's emergency meeting lasted 4 hours. Linda Maxwell presented evidence that showed this wasn't an isolated incident. Other minority passengers had faced similar treatment, but had either stayed quiet or taken their business elsewhere. The board members sat in shocked silence as they reviewed complaint after complaint that had been previously overlooked or dismissed. Sarah's investors in San Francisco greeted her with standing applause when she arrived at their meeting. Marcus Chen, the lead investor, spoke first. "Ms. Johnson, what happened to you this morning was unacceptable, but your handling of it showed exactly why we want to invest in your leadership." Meanwhile, the Federal Aviation Administration had sent a team to inspect the terminal's procedures. They discovered outdated training materials and inconsistent security protocols. The investigation expanded to other private terminals across the country, revealing a systemic problem in the industry. By afternoon, civil rights organizations had become involved. The NAACP released a statement supporting Sarah and calling for industry-wide reform. Black business leaders from across the country shared their own stories of discrimination in private aviation, creating a flood of testimonials that could no longer be ignored. The airport's legal team worked overtime drafting new policies. Patricia Williams hadn't left her office since morning, coordinating with aviation lawyers and civil rights experts to create comprehensive anti-discrimination guidelines. These would become the foundation for new industry standards. Robert Chen spent hours reviewing security footage from the past 6 months. He found multiple instances of discriminatory behavior that had gone unnoticed or unreported. Each discovery added urgency to the need for change and highlighted how long these problems had been overlooked. The young black girl from the terminal, whose name was Ashley Robinson, had become a minor social media sensation. Her mother's video of her watching the incident and declaring her new dream of owning a plane had gone viral. Sarah's office received hundreds of requests to help connect Ashley with aviation education programs. Private jet companies began calling the terminal, wanting to distance themselves from the controversy. NetJets, Flexjet, and other major players in private aviation announced immediate reviews of their own security procedures and diversity training programs. The incident had forced the entire industry to confront its biases. Mills, now jobless and infamous, released a public apology through his lawyer. "I realize now that my actions were inexcusable," he wrote. "My bias caused me to make assumptions that were not only wrong but harmful. I will use this experience to educate myself and others about the damage prejudice can cause." By evening, the airport board had approved an emergency budget for complete staff retraining. They'd also created a new position, Director of Diversity and Aviation Equity. The job description specifically called for someone with experience in both aviation and civil rights law. Sarah's company received thousands of messages of support, but also hundreds of resumes from minority professionals in aviation who had faced similar discrimination. Each story reinforced the importance of using this moment to create lasting change. As the sun set over Los Angeles, the private terminal looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything had changed. Security staff attended the first of many new training sessions, policies were being rewritten, and cameras were being installed to monitor and review all passenger interactions. The consequences of one guard's prejudice had set in motion changes that would reshape private aviation's future. 1 week after the incident, Sarah walked into LAX's private terminal again. This time, everything was different. New signs clearly displayed passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies. Security staff wore body cameras, and a diverse team of greeters welcomed each arriving passenger. Sarah had spent the past week turning a negative experience into positive change. Instead of filing a lawsuit, she had chosen a more impactful path. Her team had worked day and night to develop a comprehensive training program that would change how private terminals operated across the country. Ms. Johnson, Linda Maxwell greeted her. "We're ready for the first training session." She led Sarah to the terminal's main conference room, which had been transformed into a training center. 50 staff members from various private terminals sat waiting, including security personnel, customer service representatives, and managers. Sarah walked to the front of the room and began her presentation. "What happened to me was not unique," she started, "but how we respond to it will be." She shared stories from hundreds of other travelers who had faced similar discrimination but hadn't had the power to fight back. The training program she developed was practical and direct. Staff watched real security footage of discriminatory incidents, learned about unconscious bias, and participated in role-playing exercises. Most importantly, they'd heard directly from minority aviation professionals about their experiences. Ashley Robinson, the young girl who had witnessed the original incident, sat in the back of the room with her mother. Sarah had arranged for her to join a youth aviation program, and several private jet companies had offered to sponsor her future pilot training. During the lunch break, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was Thomas Mills, her former discriminator. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice shaking, "I've been speaking at diversity workshops about my mistake. Your response to my actions taught me more than punishment ever could." The afternoon session focused on practical changes. Sarah introduced a new app her tech team had developed. It would standardize security checks across all private terminals, ensuring every passenger received equal treatment. The app would also track any complaints and create transparency in how they were handled. Robert Chen presented the terminal's new hiring practices. We're partnering with aviation schools to create internship programs for minority students, he explained. We want to change not just how we treat passengers, but who gets to work in private aviation. The terminal staff had embraced the changes. Jessica, Sarah's flight attendant, had been promoted to lead a new passenger advocacy team. They would ensure all travelers had someone to turn to if they faced discrimination. Linda shared the financial impact of their new policies. Several major companies had increased their business with the terminal after hearing about the changes. Doing the right thing is also good for business, she noted. Patricia Williams from Legal stood up to explain the new reporting system. Every incident will be documented and reviewed, she said. No complaint will ever be ignored again. The terminal now had a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. As the training session ended, Sarah received news that made her smile. The FAA had decided to make her training program mandatory for all private aviation facilities in the country. What started as one terminal's response would now become a national standard. The local news crew arrived to cover the story. They interviewed Ashley, who proudly showed them her new pilot training books. Ms. Johnson didn't just stand up for herself, Ashley told them. She stood up for all of us who dream of being in aviation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. Other industries were reaching out, wanting to learn from her approach. Hotels, restaurants, and exclusive clubs all wanted to implement similar training programs. As she prepared to board her plane that evening, Sarah looked around the transformed terminal. New faces worked alongside familiar ones. The security check was thorough but respectful for every passenger. Signs in multiple languages welcomed travelers. The young security officer who checked her credentials this time was a black woman, recently hired as part of the terminal's new diversity initiative. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson," she said quietly. "Because of you, I got this chance." Sarah smiled, knowing that her response to discrimination had created opportunities for others. She had chosen education over anger, change over punishment, and progress over revenge. The private aviation industry would never be the same. 1 year after the incident, Sarah Johnson stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a room full of aviation industry leaders. The changes that began in one private terminal had grown into a nationwide movement for equality in private aviation. "Today, we celebrate progress," Sarah began, looking out at the diverse faces in the crowd. In just 1 year, reported cases of discrimination in private aviation have dropped by 80%. But more importantly, we changed the culture of an entire industry. The numbers backed up her words. Over 500 private terminals across the country had implemented her training program. More than 2,000 minority professionals have been hired in various aviation roles, from pilots to terminal managers. The FAA had made anti-discrimination training mandatory for all aviation personnel. Ashley Robinson, now 14, sat in the front row. She wore a pilot trainee uniform, having completed her first year in the youth aviation program Sarah had helped create. Behind her sat 20 other young people from minority backgrounds, all part of the new generation of aviation professionals. Thomas Mills was there too, but in a very different role. After his public apology, he had dedicated himself to speaking about his experience and helping others recognize their own biases. He now worked with civil rights organizations, using his story to teach others about the importance of treating everyone with respect. "Mr. Mills," Sarah acknowledged him from the podium, "showed us that people can change when given the opportunity to learn and grow. Sometimes the best teachers are those who learn the hardest lessons." The LAX private terminal had become a model for others to follow. Its new hiring practices, security protocols, and customer service standards were being copied around the world. Private terminals in Dubai, London, and Tokyo had all adopted similar programs. Linda Maxwell, now promoted to National Director of Aviation Equity, presented the latest statistics. In the past year, our private terminals have seen a 30% increase in minority clients. When people feel welcome, they come back. Robert Chen shared stories of change from ground level. Security checks were now standardized across all terminals. Body cameras had become standard equipment. Every complaint was investigated thoroughly, and monthly reports were published showing how issues were resolved. Jessica, Sarah's former flight attendant, had been promoted to run diversity training for all cabin crew members across multiple airlines. "We're not just changing rules," she explained, "we're changing hearts and minds." The young black security officer who had thanked Sarah a year ago was now a terminal supervisor. She had implemented several new programs, including mentorship opportunities for minority employees and regular community outreach events. Sarah's tech company had developed new software that was now used industry-wide. The app tracked every passenger interaction, ensuring equal treatment and quick response to any concerns. It had become the standard tool for private aviation security worldwide. As Sarah concluded her speech, she invited Ashley to join her at the podium. When Ashley watched what happened that day, she could have learned that dreams have limits. Instead, she learned that barriers can be broken. Ashley stepped forward confidently. "Next year, I'll be old enough to start my pilot's license training," she announced. "And I'm not the only one. 20 of my classmates are here today, all pursuing careers in aviation. We're the future Ms. Johnson helped create." The ceremony ended with the announcement of a new scholarship program. The Sarah Johnson Aviation Initiative would provide full funding for 100 minority students each year to pursue careers in private aviation, from pilot training to airport management. As people mingled after the ceremony, Sarah noticed something remarkable. The crowd reflected the diversity she had always hoped to see in aviation. People of all backgrounds discussing future projects, sharing experiences, and planning new initiatives. Thomas Mills approached her one last time. "Ms. Johnson," he said quietly, "thank you for showing me a better way. Your response didn't just change the industry, it changed lives." Sarah looked around the room one final time. The incident that could have ended in anger and lawsuits had instead sparked a revolution in private aviation. As she prepared to leave, she overheard Ashley telling a reporter her plans for the future. "Someday," Ashley said confidently, "I'll own my own plane too. And when I do, I'll make sure everybody knows that the sky belongs to all of us."